The great council chamber stretched out like a small planet with seats arranged in perfect circles that went up and up until they touched the curved ceiling made of some kind of crystal that let starlight through. Ambassador Jin Woo sat in the human section, which was smaller than most others and placed near the back, where the light was dim and the air tasted of recycled atmosphere and disappointment. His uniform was clean and pressed, but it looked simple next to the flowing robes and glowing energy fields that other species wore like natural skin. Sujin sat beside him with her military medals catching what little light reached them, and her face set in the kind of expression that said she was ready for trouble. The Vraxian delegate stood at the center, speaking platform, and his crystal body threw rainbow patterns across the floor as he moved his arms in wide gestures that meant he was making important points about important things. His voice came through the translation devices as smooth and cold as winter metal, and every word felt like it was chosen to cut deep and leave marks that would not heal quickly. The human species has served its purpose during the recent conflict with entities from dark space, the Vraxian said, and paused to let his words sink into every mind in the vast chamber. Their willingness to engage in violent confrontation proved useful when more civilized approaches failed to stop the void creatures from consuming entire star systems. Jinwoo felt his jaw muscles tighten but kept his face blank, like he had learned to do during 40 years of diplomatic service. Around the chamber he could see other species nodding their various heads or flashing agreement colors, or making the small sounds that meant they thought the Vraxian was speaking truth and wisdom. However, the Vraxian continued, and his voice got even colder. Now that peace has returned to our galaxy, we must consider what place such aggressive and primitive beings should have in our advanced civilization. Sujin made a small sound deep in her throat that might have been a growl, or might have been something worse. Jinwoo put his hand on her arm and felt the tension in her muscles like steel cables pulled too tight. They had both fought in the Void War, and they both knew what the Vraxian was really saying without saying it directly. The ethereal representative rose from her seat in a flow of light that made her look like she was made of captured starshine and silver dreams. Her voice was like music played on instruments that did not exist in normal space, and when she spoke, the translation made her words sound like they were being sung by angels who had never known pain or fear, or the simple human need to belong somewhere. "My fellow council members," she said, and her form shifted through colors that had no names in any human language. "We must face the uncomfortable truth about our human companions. During the crisis, they proved valuable as soldiers and little else. Their emotional instability and tendency toward violence served a purpose when violence was needed. But such traits have no place in the sophisticated society we are building among the stars." Jinwoo stood up slowly and felt every eye in the chamber turn toward him like searchlights looking for targets in the dark. The weight of their attention pressed down on his shoulders, but he had carried heavier burdens and survived worse examinations of his worth and the worth of his entire species. "Honored members of the council," he began, and his voice carried clearly through the chamber without amplification, because humans had learned to make themselves heard when it mattered. "Humanity requests that the council reconsider this judgment. We have contributed more than military service to the galactic community. Our scientists have worked alongside yours to develop new technologies. Our artists have shared their creations. Our philosophers have added their voices to the great conversations about meaning and purpose that bind civilized beings together." A sound like mechanical laughter came from the mechanoid section, and their spokesman rose with movements that were too precise and too perfect to belong to anything made of flesh and bone and blood. His optical sensors focused on Jinwoo with the intensity of targeting systems, and his voice held all the warmth of vacuum and absolute zero. "Human philosophy consists mainly of violent entertainment and emotional outbursts that serve no logical purpose," the mechanoid said with the certainty of a computer that had calculated all possible outcomes and found them wanting. "Human science lacks the mathematical elegance and theoretical depth that mark true understanding of universal principles. Human art is crude and focuses on primitive themes that civilized minds have long since transcended." More agreement sounds filled the chamber, and Jinwoo felt the weight of centuries of prejudice and misunderstanding settling around him like chains made of fear and ignorance. He looked around at species who had fought beside humans during the darkest days when void creatures poured through dimensional barriers like living nightmares made of hunger and destruction. He saw beings who had watched human soldiers throw themselves into hopeless battles to buy time for evacuations. He saw representatives of worlds that still existed because human fleets had held the line when everyone else had retreated to safer positions. The observer delegate floated in her section surrounded by energy fields that bent light and made her appear to exist in several dimensions at once. Her mental voice touched every mind in the chamber directly without need for translation devices, and her words felt like cold wind blowing across empty graves. The statistical analysis is clear, she projected with mathematical certainty that left no room for argument or appeal. Human integration into galactic society has reached the point of diminishing returns. The cost of accommodating their primitive social structures and emotional needs now exceeds the benefits they provide. Logic dictates termination of their membership status. Council Prime Veltar rose from the highest seat in the chamber, and his crystalline form caught all the light in the room and threw it back amplified and focused like a weapon made of pure illumination. When he spoke, his voice carried the authority of ages and the weight of decisions that would reshape the galaxy for generations to come. "The motion before us is simple," he announced with the finality of a judge passing sentence on condemned criminals. "Humanity will be graciously permitted to return to their home system. Their membership in the Galactic Council is hereby revoked. Their access to advanced technologies developed through cooperative research is terminated. They have 6 standard months to withdraw from all territories beyond their original solar system." The vote was swift and decisive, like the fall of an executioner's blade. Species after species indicated their agreement with lights and sounds, and gestures that all meant the same thing. The humans were no longer wanted. The humans were no longer needed. The humans were being sent home like children who had misbehaved at a gathering of adults. Jinwoo gathered his materials with hands that did not shake, despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. Sujin sat beside him rigid with controlled fury in her hand resting on the ceremonial weapon that marked her rank in service. Around them the chamber began to empty, as species departed to attend to more important matters than watching humans face the consequences of being too primitive for civilized company. "Ambassador," Sujin whispered when most of the delegates had gone, and her voice carried decades of loyal service and betrayal that cut deeper than enemy weapons ever could. "What do we do now?" Jinwoo looked up at the crystal ceiling where starlight painted patterns that would continue long after everyone in the chamber was dust and memory. Somewhere out there among those stars were human colonies and research stations and military bases that would soon be abandoned. Somewhere out there were humans who had called this galaxy home and built lives among beings who had just declared them unworthy of continued existence. "We go home," Jinwoo said quietly, and his words fell into the empty chamber like stones dropped into deep water. "And we remember this day." The Great Exodus began 6 months later when the first human transport ships powered up their engines and turned their backs on the galaxy that had rejected them. Captain Dong-hyun stood on the bridge of the generation ship New Seoul and watched through the viewports as smaller vessels joined his convoy like metal fish swimming toward the same distant shore. The ship was massive enough to hold 50,000 colonists and their entire lives packed into cargo holds and personal quarters that would be home for the long journey back to Sol system. Behind them, the lights of Vega Station went dark, one by one, as the last human personnel completed their shutdown procedures and prepared to abandon facilities they had built with their own hands over decades of patient work. Dong-hyun had served on this route for 20 years and knew every asteroid, mining platform, and research outpost that dotted the space between here and the next sector. Soon they would all be empty shells drifting in vacuum while other species moved in to claim whatever humans left behind. His communications officer turned from her station with the expression that mixed professional duty with personal anger in equal measure. "Captain, we're receiving transmission from the Vraxian Mining Consortium. They're demanding we transfer operational codes for the quantum extraction equipment before we depart." Dong-hyun felt something cold settle in his stomach like a lump of frozen metal. The extraction equipment had been developed through joint human-Vraxian research over 15 years of shared effort and breakthrough discoveries. Human engineers had solved the theoretical problems while Vraxian technicians had provided the crystalline matrix technology that made the whole system work. Now the Vraxians wanted to keep the fruits of that partnership while sending the humans away. Tell them the codes were classified as human intellectual property during the original research agreements, Donghyun replied, and his voice carried the kind of quiet authority that came from making hard decisions in difficult situations. If they want access, they can negotiate with Earth authorities after we complete our withdrawal. Deep in the research, sections of the ship Dr. Mi Young supervised the careful packing of 30 years' worth of scientific data, while her team worked around the clock to ensure nothing important was left behind. The laboratories had been her second home, and the experiments running in sealed chambers represented breakthrough discoveries that could reshape understanding of physics and consciousness and the fundamental nature of reality itself. She had shared her findings freely with galactic researchers who promised cooperation and mutual benefit. But now those same researchers wanted her gone while keeping everything she had discovered. Her assistant, Tae Min, approached carrying a data tablet that showed urgent requests from multiple species who suddenly realized what they were about to lose. Doctor, the Mechanoid Research Collective is offering to let us maintain a small facility in their sector in exchange for continued access to the quantum consciousness transfer protocols. Mi Young looked up from the sealed container that held her life's work and felt a mixture of sadness and bitter satisfaction. The consciousness transfer work had been her greatest achievement and had opened possibilities for digital immortality that every species in the galaxy wanted to explore. She had published her preliminary findings in the open research networks because she believed knowledge should be shared for the benefit of all intelligent life. Now she understood that sharing and cooperation only worked when all parties valued each other as equals. Pack everything, she said with finality that left no room for discussion or compromise. Every data file, every theoretical framework, every experimental result. If they consider us too primitive for their advanced civilization, then they can discover these principles on their own. In the military sections, General Hyunwoo coordinated the withdrawal of human forces from 17 different star systems, where they had maintained bases and defense installations for the protection of galactic shipping lanes. His soldiers were veterans of the Void War, who had faced horrors from dark space that would give nightmares to entire civilizations. They had bled and died alongside alien troops and formed bonds of brotherhood that transcended species boundaries. Now those same alien governments were escorting them out like unwanted guests who had overstayed their welcome. Major So Young entered his command center carrying reports that made her jaw tight with controlled anger. Sir, the Ethereal Defense Ministry is conducting inspections of our weapon systems. They claim some of our defensive technologies might violate their export restrictions. Hyunwoo looked up from tactical displays that showed human military assets scattered across a dozen sectors and felt the weight of command decisions that would affect thousands of lives. The weapons in question had been developed specifically to fight void creatures and had saved countless alien worlds from destruction. Human engineers had worked day and night to create defenses against enemies that existed partially outside normal space and attacked with weapons that violated known physics. Now the species they had protected wanted to examine those weapons like archaeologists studying primitive tools. All functional systems were removed yesterday, Hyunwoo replied, with satisfaction that came from planning ahead and trusting his instincts about alien motivations. They can inspect empty shells and spare parts. If they think humans are too primitive to handle advanced technology, then they can face the next interdimensional invasion with whatever they had before we arrived. The withdrawal convoy grew larger, each day as human civilian transports and military vessels and research ships joined the Great Migration back to Sol system. Families who had lived for generations on colony worlds packed their belongings and said goodbye to homes they had built, with hope and determination. Scientists abandoned laboratories where they had made discoveries that advanced galactic understanding of the universe. Soldiers left behind bases where they had stood guard against threats that most civilian populations never knew existed. Word of the human exodus spread through galactic communication networks like ripples in a pond, and the reaction was mixed satisfaction and relief from government officials who had voted for the withdrawal. News commentators from various species praised the peaceful resolution of what they called the human integration problem, while economists predicted rapid improvements in galactic stability and efficiency. Some civilian populations expressed regret at seeing human neighbors leave, but most seemed to accept the decision as necessary for continued galactic progress. What none of them noticed were the subtle changes beginning to ripple through systems that had grown dependent on human contributions. Over 5 decades of partnership, mining operations that relied on human-designed quantum extraction systems began experiencing decreased efficiency as maintenance schedules fell behind and replacement parts became unavailable. Agricultural colonies that had adopted human farming techniques found their crop yields declining without the intuitive understanding of soil chemistry and plant genetics that human experts had provided. Transportation networks that depended on human traffic management algorithms started showing increased delays and routing errors as the systems tried to function without the creative problem-solving approaches that human operators had developed. The Vraxian Mining Consortium discovered that their quantum extractors required constant adjustment by technicians who understood the theoretical principles behind the crystalline matrix interactions. Without human engineers who could make intuitive leaps between mathematical theory and practical application, the equipment began operating at reduced capacity. Emergency repair protocols failed because they had been designed by human minds that approached problems from unexpected angles that pure logic could not replicate. Ethereal art. Galleries found themselves displaying works that felt hollow and repetitive compared to the dynamic exhibitions that had defined their cultural renaissance over the past 50 years. Their artists struggled to recapture the creative energy that had sparked their greatest achievements but could not understand why their inspiration seemed to be fading. The raw emotional honesty and chaotic creativity that humans had brought to collaborative projects had acted as a catalyst for artistic expression that transcended traditional boundaries. Observer research institutions began noticing gaps in their theoretical frameworks where human researchers had contributed insights that seemed obvious in retrospect, but had required distinctly non-logical thinking to discover initially. The questions that humans asked often seemed primitive or poorly structured, but they led to breakthrough understanding that pure analytical reasoning could not achieve. Without those disruptive inquiries, research programs began following predictable paths that yielded incremental improvements instead of revolutionary discoveries. As the last human transport ships disappeared into hyperspace toward Sol system, the galaxy settled into what its leaders believed would be a new era of stability and progress. They had removed the chaotic element that had disrupted their orderly civilization and could now focus on the kind of measured advancement that came from logical planning and careful implementation of proven principles. The future looked bright and peaceful, and entirely under their control. 2 years after the last human transport disappeared into the darkness between stars, the first cracks began to show in the perfect order that the Galactic Council had worked so hard to restore. The Vraxian mining colonies in Kepler sector reported catastrophic failures in their quantum extraction systems during what should have been routine maintenance cycles. Equipment that had operated flawlessly for decades suddenly began producing erratic results and consuming energy at rates that made the entire operation economically impossible to maintain. Council. Prime Veltar stood in his crystal chamber, reviewing reports that made less sense each time he read them. The technical specifications looked correct, and the operating procedures had not changed, but somehow the machinery that formed the backbone of Vraxian industrial capacity was failing in ways that defied logical analysis. His best engineers worked around the clock trying to understand why systems that had been perfectly stable were now behaving like experimental prototypes built by apprentices. His chief advisor, Krikstal, approached with the hesitant manner of someone delivering news that would not be well received by those in authority. "My lord, our technicians have identified the source of the extraction system failures. The quantum interface protocols were designed by human engineers using theoretical frameworks that our scientists do not fully comprehend." Veltar felt something like ice forming in his crystalline matrix as the implications became clear. The mining equipment had been a joint development project where Vraxian crystal technology was combined with human quantum mechanics expertise to create systems that exceeded the capabilities of either species working alone. The humans had contributed the mathematical models and intuitive understanding that made the whole system function, while Vraxians had provided the crystalline components and industrial infrastructure needed for large-scale implementation. Surely, Our own experts can reverse engineer the human contributions, Veltar said with the kind of desperate confidence that comes from refusing to accept unpleasant realities. We have complete technical documentation and decades of operational experience. Krixtal shifted uncomfortably, and his form flickered with the stress patterns that appeared when Vraxians were forced to deliver unwelcome truths to their superiors. The documentation describes what the systems do, but not how the underlying principles work. Human engineers appear to have used intuitive approaches that cannot be replicated through logical analysis alone. Similar reports flooded the galactic communication networks from colonies and research stations and industrial facilities across dozens of sectors. Fusion reactors that had been upgraded with human safety protocols began experiencing cascade failures as their control systems tried to manage power fluctuations without the creative problem-solving approaches that human technicians had developed through trial and error. Agricultural systems that had fed billions using hybrid techniques developed through human understanding of soil chemistry and plant genetics started showing decreased yields as crops failed to thrive under management by species who had never learned to think like farmers instead of scientists. The ethereal homeworld faced its own crisis as the artistic renaissance that had defined their cultural golden age began to fade like colors bleeding out of fabric, left too long in harsh sunlight. Luxandra stood in the greatest gallery on her world, surrounded by recent works that felt hollow and repetitive compared to the dynamic creations that had emerged from collaborative projects with human artists. The emotional depth and chaotic creativity that humans brought to every project had acted as a catalyst that helped ethereal artists transcend their natural tendency toward perfect but sterile beauty. Her assistants worked desperately to understand why their inspiration seemed to be dying despite having access to the same materials and techniques that had produced their greatest masterpieces. They analyzed human artistic works, trying to identify the specific elements that had sparked their own creativity, but found only primitive emotional expressions that seemed to have no logical connection to the sophisticated art they had helped create. "We need to contact the human artists who worked with us," Luxandra finally admitted with the kind of reluctant acceptance that comes from exhausting all other possibilities. Perhaps they would be willing to resume collaboration on a limited basis. But when they tried to establish communication with Sol System, they found only silence. The humans had withdrawn behind a wall of radio darkness that blocked all attempts at contact. Automated defense platforms of unknown design monitored the approaches to human space and responded to inquiries with simple messages that offered no hope of renewed cooperation. Dr. Zenthara of the Observer species made the most disturbing discovery of all when her analysis of galactic innovation patterns revealed the true extent of human contributions to scientific advancement over the past 50 years. Her people specialized in data analysis and pattern recognition that could identify subtle connections across vast amounts of information, but even she was surprised by what the numbers showed when she finally compiled complete statistics. 73% of major breakthrough discoveries had either been made by human researchers working alone or by mixed teams that included human scientists contributing their distinctive approach to problem solving. The human tendency toward wild speculation and intuitive leaps between unconnected concepts had somehow catalyzed scientific progress across every field of research, from quantum physics to consciousness studies to exotic matter manipulation. "The implications are clear," she reported to her superiors with the kind of clinical detachment that observers used when discussing facts that were emotionally uncomfortable. Human researchers ask questions that other species do not think to ask because those questions seem illogical or poorly structured. However, those same questions often lead to breakthrough insights that purely analytical approaches cannot achieve or buy. Research showed that innovation rates across the galaxy had already begun declining as research programs followed predictable paths that yielded incremental improvements instead of revolutionary discoveries. Without the disruptive influence of human curiosity and creative thinking, scientific progress was slowing to the kind of steady but limited advancement that characterized pre-contact civilizations. Transportation networks throughout the galaxy began experiencing increasing delays and routing inefficiencies as management algorithms designed for logical optimization proved inadequate for handling the chaotic variables of real-world conditions. Human traffic controllers had developed intuitive approaches that could anticipate problems and implement creative solutions faster than any computer system, but those techniques could not be replicated by purely logical minds. The Mechanoid Collective discovered that their manufacturing systems had become dependent on hybrid protocols that combined their precision engineering with human adaptability and creative problem-solving. Without human technicians who could make on-the-fly adjustments and develop workaround solutions for unexpected problems, their production efficiency began declining as systems failed to cope with variations that had never been anticipated by their original designers. Even worse problems emerged in the defense sector, as military commanders realized that their tactical doctrines had been shaped by decades of cooperation with human strategists who approached warfare from completely different perspectives than any other galactic species. Human military thinking was chaotic and unpredictable, and often seemed to ignore logical principles, but it had proven devastatingly effective against enemies who expected rational responses to tactical situations. The Kethmaran Syndicate began testing galactic defenses with small raids against outer colony worlds, and found that Council military responses were slow and predictable and easily countered by any opponent who understood basic galactic tactical doctrine. Without human rapid response, fleets and their distinctive approach to military problem-solving, the galaxy's defensive capabilities had been reduced to textbook responses that worked well in theory, but failed against opponents who refused to follow expected patterns. Council sessions became increasingly desperate as species after species reported critical system failures and declining capabilities across every sector of galactic civilization. The perfect order they had worked to restore was revealing itself as a brittle structure that could not adapt to changing conditions or unexpected challenges. They had removed what they considered a chaotic and disruptive element, only to discover that chaos and disruption were essential components of a healthy civilization. Emergency committees formed to study the crisis and develop solutions, but their efforts were hampered by the same logical limitations that had created the problem in the first place. They could analyze what was happening and document the failures, but they could not replicate the kind of intuitive thinking that would be needed to develop effective responses. Finally, Zenthara presented her comprehensive analysis to a joint session of the Council with recommendations that no one wanted to hear, but everyone knew were necessary. We must contact the humans immediately and offer whatever terms are necessary to restore cooperative relationships. The galaxy cannot function without their contributions to scientific research. 5 years after the Great Exodus, the Galactic Council faced its worst crisis since the Void War, as the Kethmaran Syndicate launched coordinated attacks against trade routes that formed the economic backbone of interstellar commerce. The raiders, struck with precision and unpredictability, that made every convoy a potential target and every shipping lane a battleground where merchant vessels disappeared without trace or warning. What made the situation truly desperate was how effectively the Syndicate anticipated and countered every defensive measure that Council forces tried to implement. Admiral Vorthak of the Mechanoid Navy studied tactical reports in his command center while trying to understand how primitive raiders were defeating the most advanced military force in galactic history. His logical mind processed battle data with mechanical precision, but could find no pattern that explained why every engagement ended in Council defeat, despite overwhelming technological superiority and numerical advantage. They anticipate every tactical response, he reported to his superiors with the frustration that even mechanical minds could experience when faced with problems that defied logical analysis. Our battle plans follow established doctrine based on centuries of successful military theory, but the enemy seems to know our responses before we implement them. What the Admiral did not know was that several Kethmaran commanders were actually human mercenaries who had left Earth after the Exodus to seek their fortunes in the wider galaxy. Colonel Jae-sung commanded a battle group that had destroyed 3 Council fleets using tactics that seemed to come from a completely different understanding of how space warfare should be conducted. His approaches ignored established principles of fleet formation and strategic deployment in favor of chaotic improvisations that confused enemy commanders and created opportunities that pure logic could not anticipate. Captain Yoon Hae led strike forces that specialized in hit-and-run attacks against military installations that were supposed to be impregnable according to standard defensive theory. Her teams used equipment cobbled together from salvaged parts and creative engineering that violated every principle of proper military hardware design, but proved devastatingly effective against opponents who expected weapons and tactics to follow predictable patterns. The human mercenaries understood galactic military doctrine better than anyone because they had helped develop much of it during their years of service in Council forces. They knew exactly how mechanoid commanders would respond to tactical situations, and which approaches ethereal strategists would consider when faced with specific threats. This knowledge, combined with distinctly human unpredictability, made them nearly impossible to counter using conventional methods. Meanwhile, the Vraxian crystal cities began showing signs of structural decay as the harmony crystals that had powered their civilization for thousands of years started destabilizing in ways that threatened entire populations. The crystalline matrices that controlled everything from atmospheric processors to gravitational stabilizers were shifting out of their resonant frequencies, and no amount of traditional crystal singing could restore proper harmonic balance. Veltar no longer held the position of Council Prime after his disastrous policies had led to the current crisis, but he still worked desperately with remaining scientists to understand what was happening to the foundations of Vraxian society. The decay patterns made no sense according to crystal physics and seemed to be accelerating, despite every effort to slow or reverse the process. The humans must have done something, he insisted with the desperation of someone whose world was literally falling apart around him. Some kind of sabotage or delayed action weapon that activates years after implementation. His chief scientist Mordex examined crystalline samples under equipment that could analyze structures at the quantum level, but found no evidence of external interference or deliberate damage. My lord, the decay appears to be natural progression that our crystals have always experienced. The humans did not cause this problem, but they did develop the stabilization algorithms that prevented it from reaching critical levels. The terrible truth was that Vraxian civilization had become dependent on human quantum mechanics expertise without realizing it. For 30 years, human scientists had worked quietly in the background developing mathematical models that kept the crystal matrices stable and functional. When the humans left, they took their understanding of quantum resonance patterns with them and left behind only the automated systems that were slowly failing as conditions changed beyond their ability to compensate. The ethereal worlds faced cultural collapse as their society retreated into sterile perfectionism that produced beautiful but soulless art that satisfied no one and inspired nothing. Without the chaotic creativity that humans brought to every collaborative project, ethereal artists found themselves trapped in traditional patterns that felt increasingly hollow and meaningless. Their greatest galleries displayed works that were technically perfect but emotionally empty, like expensive decorations that had no connection to the living spirit that made art meaningful. Luxandra wandered through exhibitions that should have represented the finest achievements of her people's golden age, but instead felt like museums dedicated to a civilization that had already died. The dynamic energy that had once filled these spaces with wonder and possibility had faded until only beautiful emptiness remained. We created nothing new, she whispered to empty halls that had once echoed with the excited voices of visitors discovering revolutionary artistic expressions. We only refined what already existed until we refined the life out of it. The observer worlds found their advanced civilization stagnating, as research programs yielded incremental improvements instead of breakthrough discoveries. Their scientists could analyze existing knowledge with unparalleled precision, but could not generate the kind of creative questions that led to revolutionary understanding of universal principles. The primitive human inquiries that had once seemed poorly structured and illogical were revealed to have been the catalyst that drove scientific progress beyond the boundaries of conventional thinking. Dr. Zenthara compiled reports that showed innovation rates declining across every field of research from fundamental physics to consciousness studies. We have lost the ability to ask questions that we do not already know how to answer, she concluded with clinical accuracy that made the situation even more depressing. Human researchers provided a form of intellectual chaos that our logical minds cannot replicate. Across the galaxy, the same pattern repeated as systems failed and societies stagnated, and civilizations discovered they had become dependent on the very qualities they had dismissed as primitive and unworthy. The crude humans had not been junior partners in galactic civilization, but rather the essential catalyst that kept advanced societies growing and adapting to new challenges. Economic systems that had operated smoothly for decades began showing signs of instability as markets failed to respond properly to changing conditions. Human economists had contributed intuitive understanding of consumer psychology and creative approaches to resource management that could not be replicated by purely logical analysis of supply and demand equations. Without their input, financial networks became rigid and fragile structures that broke under stresses they could not anticipate or adapt to handle. Even medical research began declining as alien scientists realized that human doctors had contributed distinctive approaches to diagnosis and treatment that combined scientific knowledge with intuitive understanding of how biological systems responded to different therapies. The messy human tendency to try unconventional treatments and make creative connections between seemingly unrelated symptoms had led to breakthrough medical advances that saved lives across multiple species. Council sessions became exercises in collective panic as representatives from every major civilization reported cascading failures that threatened the basic functioning of galactic society. The perfect order they had worked to restore was revealing itself as a brittle structure that could only exist with constant input of the chaotic creativity they had rejected as unworthy of advanced minds. Emergency committees worked around the clock to develop solutions, but their efforts were limited by the same logical constraints that had created the crisis. They could identify problems and analyze failure patterns, but they could not generate the kind of innovative responses that would be needed to repair systems that had been designed with human input and creativity. The final blow came when intelligence. Reports revealed that human technology had advanced far beyond galactic standards during their years of exile. Sensor readings from the edges of Sol systems showed orbital habitats and industrial complexes that dwarfed anything the Council had ever built. Energy signatures indicated power generation capabilities that seemed to violate known physics, and defensive installations that made even the most advanced galactic military bases look like primitive fortifications. They have not just survived their exile, Zenthara reported to an emergency session of the full council. They have transcended it and developed capabilities that we can barely comprehend, let alone match. The decision was unanimous and desperate. The finest diplomatic vessel in galactic history approached the edge of Sol system carrying representatives from every major species and offers of partnership that had never been extended to any civilization in the long history of the Galactic Council. Luxandra stood at the observation deck watching the familiar stars that had once marked the boundary of human territory, but now seemed to guard approaches to something far more mysterious and powerful than the primitive civilization they had dismissed 7 years ago. Beside her, Feltar focused his optical sensors on readings that made no sense according to established physics, while Dr. Zenthara processed sensor data that revealed structures and energy signatures that exceeded the theoretical limits of known technology. The Sol system had been transformed into something that looked like the center of an advanced civilization that had achieved mastery over fundamental forces of reality itself. The orbital habitats around Jupiter dwarf our largest space cities. Zenthara reported with the clinical detachment that observers used when confronted with information that challenged their understanding of what was possible. The energy output from those installations suggests they have achieved controlled manipulation of exotic matter on an industrial scale. A single human patrol craft approached their vessel, moving with smooth precision that indicated artificial gravity control and inertial compensation systems far beyond anything the galaxy had developed. The ship was sleek and organic, looking like it had been grown rather than built, and its hull seemed to bend light around itself in ways that suggested integration of technologies that galactic science considered purely theoretical. Commander Wan Shik materialized as a hologram on their bridge, and his appearance was subtly different from the humans they remembered. His features were still recognizably human, but there was something about his eyes and the way he carried himself that suggested exposure to experiences and knowledge that had changed him in fundamental ways. Behind him, the delegation could see displays showing star maps that included galaxies far beyond the local cluster and technical readouts that used mathematical notation they did not recognize. "This is restricted space," Wanshik announced with professional courtesy that carried no warmth or welcome. State your business and intentions. Luxandra stepped forward and allowed her form to dim with the color patterns that ethereals use to express shame and regret. Commander, we come seeking renewed partnership between humanity and the Galactic Council. We have made serious errors in judgment and wish to discuss terms for restored cooperation. Wanshik nodded with the kind of polite acknowledgement that diplomats used when dealing with requests they had no intention of granting. Yes, you made errors, serious ones. Veltar projected forward with the desperate energy of someone whose entire civilization was collapsing around him. We offer full restoration of human membership in the Council, with voting rights that exceed those of founding species, exclusive trade agreements for rare materials from across the galaxy, territorial concessions that would establish human authority over any sectors you choose to claim. You misunderstand the situation, Wanshik replied with the patience of someone explaining simple concepts to children who had not yet learned to think clearly. This is not about compensation or political status. This is about trust and the fundamental nature of relationships between civilizations. The human commander gestured toward his displays, and the delegation saw images that took their breath away, massive ring structures that enclosed entire stars and harvested their total energy output, spacecraft the size of moons that moved between galaxies like shuttles traveling between planets, cities that existed in folded space where millions of beings lived in harmony despite coming from species that had never been discovered by galactic exploration efforts. 7 years ago, you declared humanity too primitive for membership in your galactic community. Wanshik continued with calm certainty that cut deeper than any angry accusation could have managed. Since that time, we have developed faster than light communication systems that make your hyperspace networks look like smoke signals. We have achieved matter conversion technology that allows us to transform any element into any other element at the atomic level. We have created artificial consciousness frameworks that support digital beings who exceed organic intelligence by orders of magnitude. Dr. Zenthara leaned forward with the intense focus that observers brought to any information that challenged their analytical models. Commander, surely you understand that our civilizations need each other. Your innovations combined with our resources and established infrastructure could benefit every species in the galaxy. Wanshik smiled with the kind of sad understanding that came from recognizing patterns that others could not see. Dr. Zenthara, we needed you once. We offered you everything we had to give, including our loyalty, our discoveries, our friendship, and our blood when you faced enemies that threatened your existence. You evaluated our contributions and decided we were not worthy of continued association. The delegation exchanged glances that carried the weight of civilizations facing existential crisis. Through the viewports, they could see evidence of human expansion on a scale that dwarfed anything the galaxy had achieved during thousands of years of cooperative development. Manufacturing complexes that processed entire asteroids. Research facilities that bent space around themselves to create pocket dimensions for dangerous experiments. Defense installations that made galactic military bases look like primitive fortifications built by children playing with blocks. Luxandra made one desperate attempt to reach the human commander through appeals to the emotional connections that had once existed between their species. We were wrong about your people. We allowed fear and prejudice to cloud our judgment. Surely you can find it in your hearts to forgive our mistakes and work with us to build a better future for all galactic civilizations. Wanshik nodded with genuine sympathy that somehow made his words more devastating than any expression of anger would have been. Forgiveness is always possible. We harbor no hatred toward your species or any others who participated in our exile. You acted according to your nature and your understanding of what was best for galactic civilization. Then you will consider renewed partnership? Veltar asked with crystalline hope that flickered like candlelight in a storm. No, Wanshik said simply, and his single word fell into the bridge like a stone dropped into still water. Trust cannot be restored through negotiation or compensated through trade agreements. You revealed your true nature when you believed you no longer needed human contributions to your civilization. That revelation has consequences that cannot be undone through diplomatic apologies. The commander paused and looked at each delegation member with eyes that seemed to see through their current desperation to the arrogance that had motivated their original decisions. You will make the same choice again when conditions change, and you believe you have extracted everything useful from renewed partnership with humanity. The pattern is written into your cultural DNA and cannot be altered through good intentions or temporary necessity. Zenthara made one final attempt to salvage something from the diplomatic disaster that was unfolding around them. Our civilizations are collapsing without human partnerships. Billions of beings will suffer as our societies fail to adapt to changing conditions. Wanshik acknowledged this truth with the gravity it deserved, but his expression did not change toward anything that might offer hope for the delegation. Yes, they will suffer. That is the price of the choices your leaders made when they decided humanity was expendable. We cannot and will not take responsibility for consequences that flow from decisions we had no part in making. The human commander gestured toward space beyond their ship, where sensor readings showed massive vessels preparing for journeys that would take them far beyond the local galactic cluster. We will accept individual refugees who come seeking new lives rather than representing the interests of their former governments. We will provide humanitarian aid to civilian populations who request assistance. We will share scientific knowledge that might help your species develop solutions to the problems you face. But partnership? Wanshik shook his head with finality that left no room for negotiation or appeal. Alliance between civilizations that consider each other equals? That possibility ended when you revealed that you never considered us equals at all. The holographic connection terminated, and the delegation found themselves staring at empty space while human defense platforms monitored their ship with sensors that operated on principles they could not understand. Behind them, the galaxy they represented was slowly dying as systems failed and societies stagnated, and civilizations discovered they could not function without the chaotic creativity they had rejected as primitive and unworthy. Ahead of them, human vessels prepared for expansion into realms beyond anything galactic science had imagined possible, while the species that had once dismissed them struggled with problems that might have been solved through continued cooperation and mutual respect.